Espresso Talks by Sphere Energy.
Welcome to another episode of Espresso Talks. Today we have Ute Schmid here with us in our podcast studio, a conversation that I'm personally very excited about. Ute Schmid is a professor for cognitive systems and computer science at University Bamberg and has an interdisciplinary background between the fields of psychology and computer science. A very rare but very important combination of fields, obviously, and also the reason why I'm personally super excited to have you here with us. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Ute, where do we start? Obviously, with your background in AI. I mean, you've spent how many decades in AI?
Oh, no, more than 3, I guess now.
Very impressive. So I would love to learn from you how you ended up in the field of AI and how it was working in the fields before the big hype.
Oh, yeah. Long memories. So maybe typically girl, I selected as my first degree of study psychology. But maybe a little bit unusual, I was interested in understanding how humans learn, make decisions, solve problems. And I learned really a lot about this in the domain of cognitive psychology. And my route into AI was, I think, several incidents during my psychology studies. So first, in this time, back in the 1980s, typical statistical software didn't have all the methods you wanted to have. And I thought, well, I need to learn programming for a statistical analysis I wanted to do. And so I went to a class offered by computer science about programming. In these old days, it was Pascal. And I detected that I'm really passionate about programming because in contrast to psychology, there you have absolute control. That's completely different from when you do an experiment. You have your hypothesis, you think a lot about this, and then the experiment doesn't turn out as expected. And you start thinking why, what is the reason? And in computer science, which is a constructive science, you have much more control. Of course, not when it becomes very complex, when you look to machine learning, things get different.
We start to lose control these days. Yeah.
But this was one aspect. The other one was that I visited a master's seminar course about cognitive modeling. And this was end of the 1980s, I think, and I realized, wow, you can use computer science as a kind of theoretical psychology. You can generate models which are like generative theories about the human mind. And so this was the second point which fascinated me. And basically, during my time as a doctoral researcher, first starting in psychology, I did in parallel a complete master degree in computer science. And I was so excited about that. And during this time, of course, I started my interest in AI.
Brilliant history. Thanks a lot. Yeah, I mean, in your research and your publications, you always speak about those 3 waves of AI, right? And I really like this notion or way of thinking about the history of AI. Do you mind walking us briefly through those 3 waves, focusing on, in which wave are we today and what changed to make it such a hyped field these days?
Yeah, so maybe we are now in the, 4th, 5th or even 6th wave because research is very dynamic currently. So the term 3rd wave of AI was basically coined not by me, but I think by researchers from Imperial College. As a reaction on what happened in deep learning, classification learning, deep learning mainly, let's say between 2015 and 2018, before Gen AI, obviously, right? And the idea was that the first wave has had a strong focus and also successes, which we tend to forget about, in knowledge representation, knowledge-based AI technologies. Then the second wave was statistical machine learning, classical feed-forward neural networks, support vector machines, random forests, and a lot of other things.
Sounds old, but it's not that old.
Starting in the 1990s, 2000s. And this was also the time called the winter without end. So AI winter, meaning there is a core of researchers internationally. There are still the important conferences, journals, so research happens, but much focus to basic research in the lab, not much interest from industry, not much interest from media and politics. And then 2012, the first bang before ChatGPT, end of 2022, was when Alex Krizhevsky entered the ImageNet challenge with a CNN, a convolutional neural network, and kind of got such a significant better performance than the previous approaches that this made a big change. And then AI became of interest mainly because of its power in end-to-end learning. We didn't no longer need feature vectors as input, but basically you could input images, text,
all kinds of
type series, whatever. And this end-to-end learning was a big thing. But then people started trying this out in application contexts. And as so often, from research to reality, there is lots of engineering typically necessary. And people had learned in the hard way that you really need sufficient data of high quality, that it's not just you don't need to think, put your data in and you get miracles out of it.
Unfortunately, right?
And so third wave started with the idea that we need to get additional approaches for explainable AI especially to make these big black box deep learning models more transparent, for instance, for domain experts, but also for the model developers themselves, for instance, to recognize overfitting, which means that a model is adapted too much to the training data itself. Also maybe for unfair biases, for instance, in the context of medical diagnosis problems, and so on. So this was originally the third wave idea. Then it was accompanied by neurosymbolic architectures with the idea machine learning is not everything. Makes often not much sense to learn things anew out of data, which we already know. Why don't we use what we really know explicitly and use this to constrain machine learning? Yeah.
Brilliant. So fascinating. And I mean, when we look at the current discussion or discourse, I feel like there are two camps, right? There is one camp saying that we are 1 week away from AGI, from conscious systems. And there is another camp that claims that we have nothing else than very efficient prediction machines, predicting the next best token, the next best words. I would love to hear your opinion, where you stand in between those camps or on this spectrum.
Yeah, so maybe you know the name Gary Marcus, who is very much in the AGI will not be possible corner. And I'm very sympathetic. I very much are in his camp, I would say. Yeah, I'm not sure whether this artificial general intelligence discussion now is only a marketing stunt or whether the proponents of that really mean this seriously. So I like very much a very old quote of Philip Johnson Laird, who is a cognitive scientist. He already back, I think in the 1980s, wrote in a book about cognitive science, "Is the mind a computational phenomenon? Nobody knows." Yeah, and I think that's still true. We don't know it. What I find really interesting is that one of the very well-known researchers in the domain of consciousness, the neuroscientist Christopher Koch, for a long time propagated in his books that we will be able to provide a mathematical theory of consciousness, another big word, even bigger maybe than intelligence. And of course, when we have this mathematical model, we could implement algorithms realizing that. But in his latest books, in his latest book, he wrote explicitly that consciousness is more spread than we assumed, so assigning it to more living forms, but it can never be digitalized. And maybe I can give you some points why not. So typically when you think about consciousness and people think that artificial general intelligence is not possible without what we understand about consciousness, is first inner experience, also called Qualia. What does this mean? When ChatGPT says, "Oh, I'm so sorry to hear that you have a headache," yeah, of course, it cannot be sorry in a similar way to a human, because another human has an inner experience about what pain feels like, right? And you can only have empathy if you have an idea about the feeling, the inner state another person is expressing. So that is Qualia. Qualia is also about, even when I perceive a certain object, and this is red, yeah, my inner image of what I perceive there is slightly different from yours. So when I see a red apple, yeah, it might be connotated with a different experience than yours. And so we have a similar but not identical inner experience. And
yeah, no, absolutely. And I think you showed this that discussion. I could listen to you for hours because I love it, because I agree it's probably a marketing discussion, the AGI discussion, more than a technical discussion. But I think it's also a very fascinating philosophical question. It always has been, right? And I think in the end it comes down to, do we live in a deterministic world or rather not, right? And is this boundary even black and white? And I think this discussion is very fascinating and is reflected also by the Turing test, right? And I think in the Turing test was always one key metric when assessing the maturity of artificial intelligence systems. And in 2024, I think ChatGPT, or researchers using GPT-4, claimed they have passed the Turing test. So they achieved of fooling humans in being humans. Do you think we need new metrics in assessing artificial intelligence? Or do you think it was really a major event and milestone?
Yeah. So the Turing test was first, I think, a really clever idea of Alan Turing a long time ago in the 1950s. Yeah. But it has been criticized in the domain of cognitive science for a long time. Why? Because the Turing test only measures functional equivalence, so looking at the output, yeah, but not at the inner representations or information processing in humans compared to computational models. And so even Eliza, the first chatbot by Josef Weizenbaum, which was a very, very simple system, which basically just recognized simple patterns in sentences and was able to turn a sentence into a question, was perceived as being intelligent like a human. So we nowadays speak of the Eliza effect we experience when we interact with chatbots. And I think the reason that we are tempted to assign human-like intelligence is because for a long time we humans only had experience in communicating with language, with human language, with other humans. So this question response like we talk now, and we have this agentic impression of systems like ChatGPT.
I think that's a great segue to move a bit away maybe from the modality of language, of text, which is obviously useful and interesting, especially when talking about consciousness. But I feel like when, especially in the business context, when we talk about AI, everyone talks about LLMs, or most of the companies and people talk about LLMs. What we are focusing on, and I think you as well, as we just discussed, right, also on other modalities that are maybe more relevant for engineering and maybe more relevant for our industries here in Europe. Where do you see this going, right? What is your technology roadmap in your head, right? From language to time series that you mentioned to other modalities, and is this even the right dimension to think about when looking at the tech roadmap?
Yeah, so when we think about modalities and you talk about maybe industries which are successful in Germany or Europe, I think we have this big domain of production, we have chemical industry, we have medical research, genetics and other topics. Automotive, right? Batteries, for instance. And I think that there it is really worthwhile to put effort in. For instance, you could look at molecule structures as an input for material design, for drug design. You could look, as you mentioned, at time series for making predictions about the behavior of certain materials or products, digital twins. And I think there Europe has really a big chance to make a transfer from research to worthwhile applications. Yeah. And in the current discussion, I think it's not very productive that I hear always Europe has lost in the game about the large language models. There is the US and China. I don't think that's the case, because when we would focus on large language models and other AI technologies in the context where we are strong, which is industrial production, maybe with small and medium enterprises as a backbone, in chemical industry and so on, I think there is still lots of place for innovative business.
For the language domain now, because I completely agree that we in Europe need to focus on building models technology for other domains that are relevant, other modalities that are relevant in Europe. So I completely agree. Yeah, I mean, let's talk a bit about AI trust, AI sovereignty, right? Obviously a big topic, something that we think about a lot. We work together with Stack IT, for example, from the Dieter Schwarz group, so a European cloud and compute provider, because we believe that we need to be more conscious about where we host model, how we fine-tune data, these models, and where this data flows. We do a lot of things in Europe, I think, from a regulation perspective. I think you are a part of the ACATEC and working on some of those thought leadership papers. And would love to get your perspective on what we can actually do beyond the regulation, right? What tech can we build? Do we have to build? And what do we have already in Europe that we need to leverage more?
Yeah. So in the context of the European AI Act, a high-level expert group have discussed requirements for trustworthy AI. Right? And I think these requirements are really to the core how we could come up with AI technologies made in Europe, which really have a different quality than what other countries are producing. You already talked about data quality. There is also like the copyright of data. We heard a lot about that in the context of US models. And I think when we really look at requirements like human agency and oversight, like privacy and security, like, of course, performance and robustness, but also transparency, fairness, environmental and societal well-being, accountability, these are the 7 requirements. Before we regulate, right, which might be a problem hindering progress, we should think about how can we generate AI tools which address these requirements and have them as a building block, because this would make a new quality of systems, and then it is not a regulation as a hindrance of development and business, but regulation as a driving force.
I agree. We need to start building tech here in Europe for our domains, for our industries, before talking about regulation.
Right.
I agree. Yeah, I mean, you've been working and you are still working with a lot of smaller companies, but also larger companies, some OEMs, right, on integrating, applying AI and not just large language models. What are some of the do's and don'ts when companies or CEOs of companies say that I want to now work with AI?
Yeah, so the first don't is that you shouldn't start with the fuzzy idea of doing something with AI, but you should start with a specific problem. Yeah, when you look in your domain of application, typically there are processes which are complicated, which are taking high effort, which are expensive. And so you always should first identify a problem within your product line which you want to address. And then you first think about what are the tools there are which can help me to address this problem. And this might be AI, it might be even often AI, but it is maybe not always AI, and it might be a large language model or some other Gen AI architecture, but it might also be good old-fashioned machine learning. So what I observe more in the small and medium enterprises than in the big companies is this feeling, if we don't adopt AI now, we lose on the market, but without a specific idea where AI might help. And typically the first thing people think about, this is like platform economy, right? Push everything to your customer and don't do it yourself. I think that should not be the first idea. You should not focus on producing more social media output for advertisement. Who is reading that, right? That is this really efficient, but you think more on your processes within the company first.
I agree. And think about the data that you create, which is eventually the intelligence that you create that you can leverage. Ute, last question. Now, your honest opinion. Are we living in an AI hype at the moment, or are we really part of a deeper, more fundamental technological revolution?
When I look at research and the path from research to development, I think there is a fundamental change, and there is still lots of applications and technologies to be developed, to be progressed. When I look at current discussion of many business models and applications, I think it's more a bubble. So I think I see both, right? And maybe as a last point, especially in the context of education, I think we really need to think deeper about what education should be about, that we still have competent, responsible and reflected human beings, not just people who blindly trust AI.
Yeah, for sure.
Yes.
Thank you so much. What a great episode. I'm almost a bit philosophical, which you obviously like. I still think about your statement that consciousness can never be digital. Not sure if I agree, but definitely something to think about. Thank you very much for tuning in, and see you next month. Thank you so much.